a thriving black neighborhood worth $157 million in today's dollars. Families who built homes, raised children, and created businesses over generations. Then one day, bulldozers arrive with legal papers, and everything disappears. Not through crime or natural disaster, but through the calculated application of American law. This isn't ancient history. This happened in St. Paul, Minnesota, when Interstate 94 carved through the heart of the Rondo neighborhood. But here's what will shock you. This wasn't an accident. It was part of a sophisticated, invisible system that has been quietly transferring black wealth to white hands for over a century. Today, we're going to expose the three-pronged attack that has systematically drained African American communities of trillions in generational wealth. We'll show you how zoning laws, tax codes, and legal precedents work together like a perfectly designed machine, one that continues operating today under new names and modern disguises. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the average white family has $188,200 in wealth, while the average black family has just $24,100. And more importantly, you'll see how this same playbook is being used across the African diaspora worldwide. When most people think of discrimination, they imagine whites-only signs or explicit racial bans. But what if I told you that some of the most devastating attacks on black wealth happened through seemingly neutral city planning documents? What if the real weapon wasn't burning crosses but zoning maps? Let me explain how this works. Zoning laws divide cities into residential, commercial, and industrial areas. Sounds logical, right? But buried within these technical documents are rules that have determined which families could build generational wealth and which communities would be systematically impoverished. Consider single-family zoning. Entire neighborhoods legally reserved for one house on one large lot. The language never mentions race, but the economic barrier is crystal clear. Only families with substantial capital could afford large lots in these zones, effectively creating white-only enclaves through economic exclusion. Minneapolis provides a stark example. For decades, 75% of all residential land was locked into single-family zoning. This made duplexes, triplexes, and affordable housing illegal in 3/4 of the city. Black families, already battling discriminatory lending practices, were shut out of neighborhoods where property values were destined to skyrocket. When Minneapolis finally eliminated single-family zoning in 2018, making national headlines as a progressive breakthrough, it was already too late. Home prices in those formerly exclusive zones had risen 56% between 2000 and 2018, pricing out the very people the reform was supposed to help. Think about this. While Minneapolis was being praised for its progressive zoning reform, black families had already lost decades of potential wealth accumulation. The damage was done, the wealth extracted, and the gap permanently widened. But exclusion from wealthy areas was only half the strategy. The other half involved trapping black communities in deliberately devalued zones through environmental racism. Take Pleasantville, Houston, a historically black community surrounded by warehouses, trucking depots, and chemical facilities. This wasn't an accident. Zoning designations classified the area as light industrial, meaning black homeowners were legally required to live next to industries that wealthy white communities would never tolerate. The economic impact is devastating. According to a 2020 Rice University study, home values in Pleasantville are 35% lower than comparable neighborhoods without industrial zoning. But the hidden costs go far beyond property values. Higher health risks mean increased medical expenses that further drain family wealth. This is economic warfare disguised as urban planning. While white families in single-family zones see their property values appreciate, black families in industrial zones watch their investments stagnate or decline, all by legal design. Zoning doesn't just control where people live. It dictates where businesses can operate and how they can grow. For black entrepreneurs trying to build generational wealth through business ownership, zoning became an invisible ceiling. Opening a shop in high-value commercial areas meant navigating deliberately complex red tape and restrictive permitting processes. Meanwhile, corporate chains received exemptions and fast-track approvals. The message was clear. Black business ownership would be tolerated, but not in areas where real money could be made. This creates a vicious cycle. Black entrepreneurs are pushed into lower-value commercial districts, limiting their customer base, reducing their profits, and preventing the kind of business growth that builds lasting family wealth. And here's the most insidious part. Once zoning maps establish these patterns, they become self-perpetuating. Neighborhoods designated for industrial use rarely transition into thriving residential communities. Single-family enclaves resist new housing options that might allow diverse residents to move in. The original design becomes destiny, locking in wealth patterns for generations. Even for black families who manage to overcome zoning barriers, buying property in undervalued neighborhoods or starting businesses in restricted areas, the system had another weapon waiting: the tax code. America's tax system appears neutral on its surface, filled with complex numbers and regulations that seem to apply equally to everyone. But when you examine who actually benefits from these policies, a clear pattern emerges. The tax code is designed to accelerate wealth for those who already have assets, while penalizing those who work for wages. Let's start with the mortgage interest deduction, one of America's largest housing-related tax breaks. The concept sounds fair. If you're paying interest on your home loan, you can deduct it from your taxable income, lowering your tax bill. But here's where it gets interesting. This benefit is far more valuable for households with expensive homes and higher incomes, historically meaning white homeowners in affluent neighborhoods that black families were systematically excluded from. The numbers tell the story. 80% of the mortgage interest deduction's $25 billion in annual benefits go to households making more than $100,000 per year. Black families, concentrated in lower-value neighborhoods due to decades of discriminatory zoning and lending, receive a fraction of these benefits. So even when black families follow all the traditional financial advice, buy a home, pay the mortgage, maintain the property, they get less tax relief than their white counterparts with more expensive homes. The government is literally subsidizing white wealth accumulation while providing minimal support to black homeowners. The tax code's bias becomes even more pronounced when examining investment income. Money earned from stocks, bonds, and property sales receives preferential treatment compared to money earned from wages. Long-term capital gains are taxed at lower rates than regular income. But who owns stocks and investment properties to sell? According to Federal Reserve data, only 34% of black families owned stock in 2020, compared to 61% of white families. This isn't a coincidence. It's the result of decades of exclusion from wealth-building opportunities. The tax system rewards investment income precisely because black families were historically denied access to these investments. It's a perfect example of how seemingly neutral policies perpetuate existing inequalities. Then there's inheritance, where the step-up in basis rule resets the taxable value of inherited property to its market value at the time it's passed down. This effectively erases years of capital gains tax liability, allowing wealthy families to transfer millions tax-free. But black families, historically denied opportunities to accumulate significant property or stock portfolios, rarely benefit from these inheritance loopholes. And when they do inherit wealth, it's typically half the size of white inheritances, $100,000 versus $195,500 on average. Even small business tax benefits tilt away from black entrepreneurs. Credits and deductions often require high startup capital, sophisticated accounting, or property in designated development zones. Areas many black businesses can't access because of those same zoning restrictions we discussed earlier. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle. Black-owned businesses remain smaller, scale more slowly, and generate lower profits, which reduces their eligibility for tax breaks designed to promote business growth. This isn't accidental. When you combine zoning laws that restrict where black businesses can operate with tax policies that favor businesses with substantial capital, you create a system that legally limits black entrepreneurship while subsidizing white business expansion. By the time zoning laws determined where black families could live and tax codes shaped how much wealth they could accumulate, there remained one final question. What happens when someone else wants that land? This is where legal precedents come into play, and their history reveals the most disturbing aspect of America's wealth extraction system. Laws designed to appear neutral have repeatedly given government agencies and private developers the tools to seize black property under the banner of progress. The legal framework began with racially restrictive covenants, contracts written into property deeds explicitly prohibiting the sale of homes to black, Jewish, Asian, or Hispanic buyers. These weren't just individual acts of discrimination. They were systematic legal instruments that locked entire communities out of wealth-building neighborhoods. Although the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley v. Krumer, 1948, that such covenants couldn't be enforced by courts, the damage was permanent. Black families had been excluded during the crucial decades when suburban property values were exploding. A 2017 UCLA study found that properties once protected by racial covenants still carried 60% higher values compared to historically unrestricted neighborhoods. The legal exclusion created wealth disparities that persist today, nearly 80 years after the practice was banned. But exclusion wasn't enough. The system also needed a way to take property from black communities that had managed to build wealth despite the restrictions. Enter eminent domain, the government's right to seize private property for public use. The destruction of St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood for Interstate 94 construction exemplifies how this worked. Federal highway planners had multiple route options, but they chose the path that devastated a thriving black middle-class community. Nearly 80% of residents were displaced, and $157 million in property wealth, in 2020 dollars, simply vanished. Rondo's story repeated across America. Similar highway and urban renewal projects destroyed black business districts in Detroit, New Orleans, and Miami's Overtown neighborhood. The pattern was consistent. When infrastructure projects needed land, they took it from black communities, justifying the seizure as serving the public good. Modern legal precedents have evolved beyond outright seizure. Today's weapon of choice is the blight designation, labels given to neighborhoods deemed deteriorated to access tax incentives and fast-track property acquisition. These designations are disproportionately applied to older black neighborhoods, even when communities are stable and home to long-term residents. Once labeled blighted, property values plummet, making it easier for developers to buy land cheaply and redevelop it for wealthier residents. The legal justification is always the same: eliminating blight serves the public interest. Courts consistently agree, even when the evidence of actual deterioration is minimal. The 2008 subprime lending crisis demonstrated how financial regulations enable wealth extraction. Lenders aggressively pushed black borrowers into high-cost subprime mortgages, even when they qualified for prime rates. These loans carried higher interest rates and risky terms that led to mass foreclosures when the housing bubble burst. The legal justification? Banks argued that risk-based pricing was allowed under federal banking regulations. By the time lawsuits and settlements were negotiated, the damage was irreversible. Black households lost 53% of their wealth compared to just a 16% drop among white households. This shows how the legal system acts as an active accomplice in wealth removal, not just by failing to prevent discrimination, but by providing legal cover for practices that systematically drain black wealth. When we talk about the $157 million in wealth destroyed in Rondo, it's easy to focus on the immediate loss: the bulldozed homes, the displaced families, the shuttered businesses. But the real devastation extends far beyond that single moment. Each act of legal wealth extraction doesn't just affect the families who owned property in the 1960s. It reshapes the economic possibilities for their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In stable, wealthy communities, predominantly white suburbs, homes often pass down through generations. These properties serve as more than shelter. They become financial foundations. Parents use home equity to pay for their children's college education. Young adults inherit property that serves as collateral for business loans or down payments on additional real estate. Each generation builds on the previous one's foundation. In Rondo, that chain was shattered overnight. The children and grandchildren of displaced families never inherited the homes, rental properties, or business assets their families had spent decades building. Instead of inheriting wealth, they inherited debt, the costs of starting over with nothing. The Federal Reserve data tells the story in stark numbers. Black families are 5 times less likely to receive an inheritance compared to white families. When they do inherit, the median amount is roughly half, $100,000 compared to $195,500 for white families. But these numbers understate the true impact because they don't account for appreciation over time. Consider 2 families in 1970. One white family purchases a $100,000 home in an appreciating suburb. One black family, displaced by urban renewal, purchases a $100,000 home in an industrial-zoned area. 50 years later, the white family's home might be worth $400,000 due to zoning protections and investment in surrounding infrastructure. The black family's home, constrained by industrial zoning and environmental hazards, might be worth only $180,000. That $220,000 difference, multiplied across thousands of families and compounded over generations, explains how legal systems create permanent wealth gaps. The generational impact extends beyond home ownership to business development. A black-owned grocery store forced out by urban renewal in the 1980s doesn't just lose customers and property, it loses the opportunity to build brand equity, expand to multiple locations, and create jobs for community members. Meanwhile, the chain store that replaces it benefits from tax incentives, subsidies, and economies of scale. These advantages allow it to dominate the local market, preventing new black entrepreneurs from establishing competing businesses. This pattern locks black entrepreneurs into survival mode rather than wealth-building mode. They're constantly rebuilding rather than expanding, which affects not just their families but entire communities that depend on black-owned businesses for employment and local investment. Perhaps most insidiously, repeated displacement creates psychological patterns that further inhibit wealth accumulation. Families who have lost everything once often become risk-averse, avoiding investments or business opportunities because they fear sudden loss. This caution, while understandable, can slow wealth accumulation compared to families who feel secure in their property rights and confident about long-term investments. When you expect your assets to be taken, you're less likely to invest in assets that appreciate over time. These generational impacts help explain why today's racial wealth gap persists, despite civil rights legislation and anti-discrimination laws. The average white family's $188,200 in wealth versus the average black family's $24,100 isn't just about current income differences. It reflects decades of compound losses from legal wealth extraction. And here's the crucial point. These systems haven't disappeared. They've evolved, creating new mechanisms for wealth transfer that are harder to see but just as effective. The most disturbing aspect of America's wealth extraction system isn't its historical existence, it's how seamlessly it has adapted to modern times. When old zoning maps were redrawn and explicitly racist covenants were banned, the system didn't disappear. It evolved, taking on new forms that are harder to identify and even more difficult to challenge. Today's version of the Rondo Highway Project is called revitalization, or urban renewal. Cities promote these initiatives as bringing better housing, improved transportation, and thriving commercial districts to underserved communities. The language is positive, the intentions appear benevolent, and the process seems market-driven rather than government-mandated, but the results are identical to the highway projects of the 1960s. Developers identify undervalued properties in historically black neighborhoods, purchase them at below-market rates, and then drive up prices and taxes so dramatically that original residents can no longer afford to stay. Unlike the blunt trauma of bulldozers and eminent domain, this process happens incrementally. Families don't lose their homes overnight, they're slowly priced out over months or years. By the time displacement is complete, it appears to be the result of natural market forces, rather than systematic wealth extraction. The original communities lose their homes and businesses, but outside investors collect massive returns on properties they acquired cheaply. It's the same wealth transfer mechanism, operating under a more palatable name. The subprime lending crisis exposed how traditional banking practices devastated black wealth. Regulators responded by tightening some rules and increasing oversight, but rather than ending predatory practices, the industry innovated around the restrictions. Modern predatory lending takes the form of rent-to-own schemes, contract-for-deed sales, and alternative financing products. These programs specifically target families shut out of traditional mortgages, often because credit scoring models penalize people for historical patterns correlated with discrimination. The contracts appear to offer home ownership opportunities, but they're loaded with hidden fees, variable interest rates, and clauses that make it easy for buyers to lose their homes after missing just one payment. Families think they're building equity, but they're actually paying premium prices for properties they'll likely never own. Even more insidiously, algorithmic decision-making in banking and insurance has automated discrimination. Credit scoring algorithms rely on data points, zip codes, rental payment histories, employment patterns that correlate with historical exclusion from wealth-building opportunities. Studies consistently show that Black and Hispanic applicants are more likely to be denied loans or charged higher interest rates, even when income and financial behavior are similar to white applicants. What used to require a biased loan officer now happens automatically through neutral algorithms, making discrimination harder to prove while producing the same outcomes. Meanwhile, tax policy continues favoring capital over wages. The wealthy benefit from lower capital gains rates, tax-deferred investment accounts, and inheritance tax loopholes. Black families, who were systematically excluded from wealth-building opportunities decades ago, remain disproportionately dependent on wage income rather than investment returns. This means that even as income levels slowly improve for some Black families, wealth gaps continue expanding. The tax system rewards exactly the types of assets that Black families were historically prevented from accumulating. The modern system also exploits the psychological impact of historical displacement. Communities that experienced repeated financial loss often approach homeownership and investment more cautiously, choosing safer but less lucrative financial paths. Combined with ongoing systemic barriers like algorithmic credit scoring and predatory lending, these behavioral adaptations reinforce the wealth extraction cycle. Fewer investments mean fewer tax advantages and slower wealth growth, while outside investors continue benefiting from neighborhood turnover and rising property values. All of this operates with minimal public awareness because modern systems don't explicitly reference race. Technical language like risk assessment algorithms, urban revitalization, and alternative financing options rarely triggers the public backlash that explicit discrimination once did. Yet the results are eerily familiar. Black families working harder than ever, only to watch wealth flow elsewhere, while new rules keep the playing field permanently tilted. What we've documented in American cities isn't unique to the United States. The same playbook, zoning restrictions, tax advantages for existing wealth, and legal precedents that enable property seizure, has been exported globally, affecting African communities worldwide. The legal frameworks we've examined have deep colonial roots. European powers used similar zoning laws, discriminatory taxation, and property seizure throughout Africa during the colonial period. They designated the most valuable land for white settlers, while confining African communities to less productive areas. When African nations gained independence, Many inherited these legal structures. Zoning laws that favored colonial settlers often remained in place, continuing to benefit foreign investors and local elites while restricting indigenous wealth accumulation. Modern international development projects often mirror the highway construction that destroyed Rondo. Dams, mining operations, and infrastructure projects frequently displace African communities under the justification of economic development. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund have funded thousands of projects that required involuntary resettlement of local populations. Like American urban renewal, these projects promise benefits for affected communities, but the wealth generated typically flows to international corporations and urban elites. In recent decades, foreign corporations and governments have acquired millions of acres of African agricultural land through land grabbing, large-scale land acquisitions that displace small farmers and pastoral communities. These deals are structured legally, often with government approval, but they mirror the blight designations used in American cities. Traditional farming communities are labeled as underutilizing productive land, justifying its transfer to foreign corporations for export-oriented agriculture. The result is identical to American gentrification. Local communities lose their primary source of wealth, land, while outside investors capture the economic benefits. This global context helps explain why leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso have emphasized economic sovereignty alongside political independence. They understand that legal and financial systems can extract wealth just as effectively as military occupation. When Traoré speaks about breaking free from neocolonial systems, he's addressing the same types of legal and financial mechanisms that have drained wealth from Black communities in America. The specific tools may vary: currency manipulation instead of zoning laws, resource extraction agreements instead of tax loopholes. But the underlying pattern is identical. Recognizing these patterns reveals that the racial wealth gap in America is part of a global system designed to extract wealth from African communities wherever they exist. Whether it's highway construction in St. Paul, gentrification in Atlanta, or land grabbing in Mali, the same fundamental dynamic operates. Legal mechanisms that appear neutral enable systematic wealth transfer from Black and African communities to white and Western institutions. This perspective helps explain why Pan-African solidarity remains relevant in the 21st century. The challenges facing African Americans in Minneapolis and small farmers in Burkina Faso are connected through shared histories of legal wealth extraction. The story we've traced, from zoning maps to tax codes to legal precedents, reveals something far more disturbing than individual acts of discrimination. We've documented a sophisticated system designed to systematically drain wealth from Black communities while protecting and accelerating white wealth accumulation. This isn't ancient history. The $157 million destroyed in Rondo continues rippling forward, affecting grandchildren who never inherited the homes and businesses their families built. The single-family zoning that excluded Black families from appreciating neighborhoods still shapes property values today. The tax advantages that reward investment income still benefit families who were never locked out of wealth-building opportunities. And the system continues evolving. Gentrification replaces highway construction. Algorithmic discrimination replaces biased loan officers. Revitalization replaces urban renewal. The names change, but the fundamental mechanism remains. Legal frameworks that appear neutral while systematically transferring wealth from Black hands to white ones. Understanding this history changes how we interpret the present. The racial wealth gap isn't about individual financial choices or cultural differences. It's about a structure designed to produce exactly these outcomes. When the average white family has $188,200 in wealth, compared to $24,100 for the average Black family, we're seeing the compound result of decades of legal wealth extraction. But here's what gives me hope. Systems designed by humans can be redesigned by humans. Once we understand how these mechanisms operate, we can work to dismantle them. That requires more than individual success stories. It requires changing the legal, financial, and political structures that continue enabling wealth extraction. This is why the work of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré matters far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. When African leaders assert economic sovereignty and challenge neocolonial financial systems, they're fighting the global version of the same battle that American civil rights activists fought against: redlining and restrictive covenants. The question isn't whether these invisible rules were designed intentionally. The evidence clearly shows they were. The question is what we do with this knowledge. Do we accept that the racial wealth gap is permanent, the inevitable result of past injustices that can't be undone? Or do we recognize that the same legal and financial mechanisms that created this gap can be reformed to repair it? The choice is ours, but only if we first understand what we're fighting against. What do you think? Were these invisible rules accidental byproducts of well-intentioned policies, or were they deliberately designed to transfer wealth from Black communities to white ones? How different would America, and the world, Look today if black wealth had never been systematically drained through legal mechanisms. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this analysis opened your eyes to how these invisible systems operate, hit that like button and share this video with others who need to understand these connections. And subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you the African perspectives and historical analysis that mainstream media won't touch. The story of wealth extraction from African communities is far from over, but understanding how these systems work is the first step toward dismantling them. Until next time, stay conscious, stay connected, and keep fighting for economic justice.